Welcome to Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn Group. I'm Jeff Nugent, and as you can see, I'm up at my cabin on a very, very special edition with one of my favorite people in the world. And we've been reminiscing on a few times we bumped into each other. We're always rushing to meetings and things at conferences and always have really awesome conversations. And so we have got a great topic and an amazing person to speak on the topic. So the topic today is the power of curiosity and the impact on society and the workforce. And who better to talk about this topic is Pam Sands. You may know her from Kelly Services, but not only has she been in the industry for 30 years, and she actually started as a temp before getting into staffing, working in a number of roles within the MSP and the workforce management space. And more recently, throughout her career, she's always taken on national board level roles and is more recently with the World Employment Confederation. So really has a global view of things as well. So Pam, thank you so much for joining me at the cabin. And I think you're joining me from a special place too.
Absolutely. And Jeff, it is so good to be with you. And I'm so glad that we were able to finally do this. And actually, the fun part is we're bringing people into our conversations we normally have, which is just incredible. And so first and foremost, I have to cover on something really important. You mentioned how many years I've been in this industry. I just want everybody listening to know that I signed my original application with a crayon. And it was a preschool recruitment program. And before anybody does any math, we'll just start there, which is great. But I love that I'm joining you in your cabin. I think this has to be the new place you do these from because the visual back here is fantastic. But I'm actually sitting in the extra bedroom of my daughter's place in Chattanooga, which is fascinating when you're at that stage in life and you get to work from where your kids live because they've done so much where you live and where they live for years. So it's great to be here. We're both in the mountains, and that's always a good place to be at this time of year.
It's awesome. And I know we're going to talk about the demographic shifts and things like that later on when we're talking about certain things that we should be more curious about. But it is amazing to see again. And thanks for figuring out our schedules. I know it's been lots of fun. So curiosity, I love this topic because people have called me curious many, many times. And I often call myself lucky more than anything else. But I think some of my luck comes from being curious and meeting people like yourself that, have such great views on things, and we get into really cool conversations. So without further ado, I wanted to start, and of course, we can also talk about the changes and the trends in technology. And I'm going to start with the definition of curiosity that my friend ChatGPT has given me is the desire to learn or know about something. It involves eagerness to explore, discover, and understand new information and experiences. And I think that is very important, but also what's important is to understand the impact, especially if we start to bring that back to the impact on society. And then in where we all live and play is in the workforce. And so it's really important to also start to think about how these new trends and things going on and experiences going on have an impact. And they always do. So, what are some of the things that you're curious about right now?
Well, that's a dangerous question, Jeff, right? So I'll have to really focus it in for this conversation. But I like to say to folks, I start most of my days with imagine if conversations around things. Some of my best days and my happiest times are when somebody comes and there's a challenge or something that's looked to be solved. And I start with literally a blank sheet of paper, a little analog, a little old school. I know there's lots of tools out there, but there's something about a pen on paper designing what the problem is and the solution. And so there's a lot out there to be curious about right now too, right? I mean, we're in a very interesting time. But some of the things that I've really been paying attention to this year are really tied to the global theater and the global stage. This is a really fascinating year because it's a super year when it comes to elections, right? So around the globe, just about half of the world's population has the opportunity to be involved in an election this year, and many already have been around the globe. Actually, 1 billion people have already cast their vote, for society, for where they live. And what's coming from that, Jeff, is that there's a lot of things that happen when you see shifts in the political realm from a geopolitical perspective. And those are things that impact us directly in this industry when it comes to labor market conditions, when it comes to the movement of talent around the globe, when it comes to border conversation issues, economic issues, and then also human rights issues. And you can't leave out of that right now. A really important consideration and conversation are many of these things tied to UN objectives, the environment, and how that impacts not only business, but most importantly, one of the things we're all deeply committed to, which is work and the value of work for individuals. So there is a lot to unpack in that. There's a lot of other curiosities, but that one keeps me busy most days, to be quite honest, without a lot of free time if I just focus on that one.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because it's not only the election itself and then afterwards, it's the pre and
Yes.
how companies hire, how people are feeling, um, and all of these things, and especially, in the US, what we're seeing is always the lead up to November. And often you see companies holding back on making hiring decisions, big budget changes, these types of things. So there's that side, but there's also the talent side. Maybe they don't want to make changes, or if they're going to make changes, it's only short term before an election, because some of the what you're talking about uh, in the elections, they have an impact on the companies that they would potentially work for. So they may not want to make changes either, um, in the short term, as well as, how it impacts after the fact, where regulations happen, employment laws change, etc.
Mhm.
What are you seeing from the talent side in this market? Like the talent, and I know it's almost a demographic based scenario, but are you seeing the elections and causing anything different with the talent side or the company side as you talk about the global elections?
Yeah, so what's fascinating is those global elections are going to have their own nuances, right? By the local markets and what that's looked like. And you can't take context out of it either, Jeff, right? I mean, I don't want to get into a history lesson, but you do need to look at historical context and how the current elections are playing into that and what does that mean. What I think is important is to look at it from how we're seeing a lot of shifts in that constituency
Yeah.
for what is good for individuals, right? We see trade unions very deeply involved in that conversation, and a lot of collaboration, as there should be, between trade unions and employers. And as we look at new regulations, I think what this election year affords us all, if we do approach with curiosity, which we'll probably say more than a few times in this conversation today, is that look at it from the standpoint of we have for a long time seen disruptions that occur around the world.
Yeah.
And each time there's been a major disruption in the world wars and what happened with COVID and societal disruption that happens, there's always an impact on work and on labor and on talent, how you respond to that. So I think what we should be looking at is starting to look at the world through how work gets done and who does that work, and then build that back into our organizations versus looking at where do we want to do the work and then how do we find the talent, how do we find the skills and capabilities. We should really start looking at that people first, that human centricity, much like goes into design thinking, which is very much rooted in curiosity as well. I think if we were to start looking at, okay, here's what's happening, we need to, where we do business, really pay attention to what's happening there, but then really take a human centric approach to what we're producing, what we're asking for. I think that could give us really an advantage as we go in to the future years.
Yeah, and it seems like distant memory, and I like to make it a different distant memory, the pandemic, right? But the
Yeah.
pandemic had such a massive impact that no one could predict a lot of what went on and then how it related back to our businesses. And I remember a project we worked with you on quite often. What
Mhm.
was when the pandemic happened, a lot of the US traditional work, which was on work visas in the US, they all went home thinking they would work through this Zoom media, newfangled Zoom and Teams, etc. And then, in a few weeks, they would just go back to their US company and work within the US and pay US taxes and government payroll taxes. Then 6 months and a day happened and their residency changed. And then they needed to be employed in their global jurisdiction at home. And that was a project that actually made, was a very interesting one because it accelerated our business model. And it wasn't ever predicted that remote work was happening, but not to the extent that the pandemic brought to us. And so that's just a massive change that you couldn't really understand the consequences. And if you think about these things and are curious about them, and you start taking it back, then you can also then see opportunities for your business. And it was a great opportunity for People 2.0 because, of course, I'm no longer with People 2.0, but because of that, and we had such a global footprint to employ workers, employers were looking for those solutions. And it was in the education space we worked with you. We had a lot of international profs that we were employing all over the world for you.
Well, it definitely opened up. I mean, it was like a significant disruption. I don't think anyone would discount that. And what was fascinating about the pandemic is it was unexpected.
Yes.
So that's when you really see curiosity and innovation come forward in a big way. Think about how quickly people had to innovate to change the workplace and the workforce. And what we saw really accelerate was global talent mobility through that, no matter who you are and how you're approaching it. And that's really significant as we look at what I like to call the future of the world of work, not just the future of work, is that look at, a lot of the statistics we're seeing by 2030, we're expecting 85 million jobs to go without the talent to fill it. The impact on that is, estimated to be around 8.5 trillion in revenue that's not realized. And if you really put it in perspective, and I have so many friends and love our partners in Germany, but that's about the population of Germany.
Amazing.
And so if we look at it that way, it also allows us to bring those creative ideas and that curiosity to how do we together look to solve for some of these things? How are we looking to solve for the jobs that don't exist today? Some of those incredible jobs, like even one of my favorites that I've seen that we're expecting is garbage designers, right? Because we don't have enough places, as they say, to stash our trash, right? So they're looking at how do we upcycle and recycle, right? How do we look at auditors for algorithms in our world? Because as we become more AI centric and look to integrate the human with the AI, how are we auditing that to make sure those algorithms are where they should be? So there's a lot of that's what leads us into, I think, what we should all be doing is making some time at each of our day to poke that curiosity a little bit.
Yeah. So there's the global elections, of course, trends and different things, because depending on what parties get in, it drastically changes all of those things you mentioned: border, immigration, economics, investment in those countries. It really changes things. But it's also demographic trends that are massive right now that are whirling around. And we talked about it a little bit earlier as kind of a generation that we're still, you're at your daughter's house and I'm here with my son and we're taking care of our kids. They're in university, but our parents are aging. Some of our parents are still in the workforce and aging, but some aren't. And then we're having to take care of them as well. So you're kind of in the sandwich generation, and that's our generation, but other generations, be it millennials, Z, etc., have other needs too, right? And so demographics will play such an important role in our business going forward and have different opportunities. And so, you mentioned the labor shortages. That is just going to continue to be a massive issue because the largest population in our history is retiring and or no longer being on the planet. And one, we're having to take care of an aging massive population, but then that leaves lots of openings. And the next generations aren't looking to do the traditional roles that were manual labor and things like that. I always say, it pays to get your hands dirty these days because nobody wants to get your hands dirty, but that's a whole other story. So are you seeing the different generations, the needs, and also their wants and thoughts really affecting our business and the workforce trends?
Absolutely, Jeff. And, this is one of my favorite topics because, as I shared with you ahead of time, I feel very fortunate. I actually have within my family all 5 generations working. So, from my silent generation mother-in-law, who is 92, who is still working, as I shared with you at a funeral home, we will talk about that joke in another conversation because I know there's one in there, all the way through to my daughter, who is Gen Z. And I've actually spent some time interviewing them all. And I'm actually working on some kind of content piece or blog on that because we all know this to be true. And we've all looked at it for years, Jeff, is different generations are approaching work differently. But that has even shifted over the last couple of years. People are working longer. They want the financial freedoms. They want the travel. They want the ability to plug into work using their skills and their strengths, right? And it's not just a leave the workforce, retire, and go do those leisure activities that would make people, enjoy that part of their life. So we're starting to see that. But what we're also starting to see, and I know in asking people a lot of questions, right, is that we're also seeing the different generations that are your silent generation and your boomers, right, and even Xers, as Xers get older, looking at it from the perspective of, hey, there's a lot of new things I want to learn and I want to do. Could there be, and could we all look at, is there some kind of internship program for that? We think of internship coming 18 to 24 post-college, millennial, not even millennials anymore, Gen Zers, and now the alpha generation coming behind that, right? I think it's alpha or beta, I'm trying, what's coming next. And so, I think there's a huge opportunity there to look at that, as well as this cross mentorship. So how are Gen Zers, digital natives, right, or the true digital natives coming forward, really working with individuals who have a lot of institutional knowledge and pulling that together and reducing that gap a little bit, while we have the individuals still from silent generation and boomers in the workplace also sharing, hey, here's some of this institutional knowledge and here's how this happened. So I think there's a lot there that we can explore. And we can also look at how are we opening up opportunities by reskilling and upskilling, because I was in a really thoughtful conversation with somebody a few weeks ago that's on one of the other organizations that we're a part of. And I don't want to get ahead of some work they have coming out and do a spoiler on it. But it's also, how are we really leveraging that population over that 50 mark? I don't even want to say the number, but over that 50 mark, to really look at how are we continuing to engage them longer in a pre-retirement capacity. Because if we look at doing that, how are we then lessening that number of that 85 million that we talked about, or that estimated 85 million? So I think it's that creativity of let's look at work different and in a skills-based environment, and not just in a credential or an education-based. You give yourself a lot more flexibility.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and it's not just how do we get the bodies, it's how do we attract and skill and retrain the body. How do we attract those bodies? Because a lot of them are semi-retired or retired, and they just want to come back and work. Like you say, they want fund money to travel, or just the security that it gives them to add. But a lot of them are liking to work because they've turned out they didn't enjoy golf or being retired, and they want to keep their minds active. And so they're doing it on their terms. And with that, you have to attract them differently. Then it's not a job just for the money, it's a job for satisfaction. So are you seeing the different generations and things that are important to them coming into play in attracting the right resources to your organizations?
Seeing it and hearing about it both, Jeff, right? Because there's a lot. This is a conversation that is on the minds of so many right now. And one of the things in particular is looking at the benefits that organizations are offering. And that's a very US centric, but I think if we broaden it to other parts of the world, it's not just benefits, but the social nets that are available to support these type of thoughts. But if we look at it from a benefit perspective, there's some really cool conversations happening right now. So we're starting to see over the last couple of years, companies be even more focused on beyond wellness, beyond just mental and physical wellness and emotional, financial wellness, right, as a benefit, and helping individuals look at that. So if you're looking to retire, you're looking to extend that, you're fresh in the workplace, how are you doing that? How are you putting away for the future? How are you taking advantage of all of those things? I'm starting to see a lot of trends there. The other one that I'm very happy to see, and I know I shared this with you before, if I could put on a cape and solve this, I would, is that the student loan debt in the US is incredible. I think it's like 40 plus million individuals come into the workforce with student loan debt. And at the same time, we're starting to now look at, oh, wait, you didn't need that degree. We could hire you based on skills, right? But we can't hire you on skills because you don't have the experience. So it's this very confusing space to be. So if we could look at ways for offering a benefit that's maybe even tax deferred, and that's where being involved politically and advocating comes in, right? How could we help them pay off some of that student loan debt while they're working on their other financial initiatives? And then all the things that we all know about right now, the remote work, the flexibility of work. People are even looking at making a 4-day work week a reality. That's going to be very industry specific and job specific, obviously. But I think the key word we see in all of this, Jeff, is that it's flexibility. And people have so much power of choice now where we are, that's been opened up by a lot of these other disruptions. How are we really looking at those things creatively? How are we looking at what's possible? Not what we've done before, but what could be possible. And that can lead us into some really interesting conversations of how we all work together in the future.
Yeah, and I always find it fascinating. Every day I wake up and I zoom around the world now from my cabin in some cases. And it's incredible. And it's important not only to think about the needs of each demographic differently, that's how you're going to attract those into your organization. So when you think about the student debt issue, you also got to think about the housing issues. The housing
absolutely.
crisis, cost of housing for the next generation that's graduating. You can't force them into the towers of the big urban centers where housing is out of reach for most, or they're going to have to commute in 2-3 hours in order to get into those towers. That's just such an old school mindset of the financial institutions and other, large institutions, that the CEOs are like, hey, I want productivity up. I want to see the whites of your eyes. It's just, you're going to lose a big chunk of the talent that is saying, I'm going to move to Chattanooga and find better housing and different opportunities that are in a more affordable area than the downtown urban cores where housing has got out of control.
Well, Jeff, I'm so glad you brought that up, because now you're really speaking my love language, right? Because now this is a mixture of looking at private sector opportunity and public sector issues, right? And so affordable housing was, once, a crisis, it's now catastrophic, right? Workforce housing for those entering the market, first responders, education, all of those things is definitely at epidemic proportions, especially in the United States, right?
Yeah.
So that is something where, as we think about looking outside of ourselves and outside of the industry that we're in, and what are those impacts, we have to look at, when we're in a conversation around work, how ready is the workforce and how prepared is the environment for where they need to live, right? It's a definite issue, and the effectiveness and the cost of that. I know a lot of companies, just while we're on this vein of the conversation, a lot of companies have moved away from geo models for pay and for remuneration. It's now becoming really imperative that you look at those geo models for that, because the cost of housing is now becoming so much more than the threshold that it should be. And that's where we look at the whole person as we look at this and work, and how the whole person comes together.
No, and this is just another thing that's come on that affects how we find talent and how organizations manage them after the fact, even. So I think we could talk forever on a bunch of topics, and that is because we're both curious minds, but we have to wrap this up. So I always wrap these things up with the how. So we've talked about some of the why. You can bring it back to look at trends and be curious about things, and bring it back to how it affects your organization, your career, etc. But how do you become curious? And then how do you get good at being curious, that then understands the impact and then can work it back to yourself and advance, not only for enjoyment, but for career opportunities and business opportunities as well?
So I think it's an individual journey for folks, Jeff, in all fairness, right? Because we're all going to approach that with our own strengths, our own backgrounds, the own context, and all of that. It's just a recognition of, hey, maybe I should be a little bit more curious. And what does that look like? So, or maybe it's like, I'm already curious, I want to be more curious, or, how do I get others to be curious? So there's a lot that could be unpacked there. But a couple of things I would say is that, think about your environment where you are, and what are some of those natural things that you can look at that are just outside of that environment. So do, like we talk about in strategic workforce planning, do an environmental scan. And in that environmental scan, look at some of the things we've talked about, right? What's happening geopolitically, right? What's happening with society? What's happening, and what are the vulnerabilities of the people you need for a competitive advantage, right? And for your own social impact initiatives, and think outside that box, right? Is how I would wrap that segment up. The next thing I would do is, after you do that, do some good research, right? You can start with ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
And then do a little fact consideration there for yourself, and just start. Or how many of us start looking at Google, right? But just get out, do some research, get involved with organizations that are already in this like-minded causes, right? And then really say, what are the questions we need to ask, right? And there are a few that I think that we could ask that are pretty general, but could become specific to organizations. And that is, as we're looking at the trends that are happening right now, asking ourselves, whatever our company is, or the companies that we're supporting, what are those trends that are going to really impact my organization over the next X amount of years, whatever your strategic planning cycle is. Then follow up with that and say, so how will those trends help us move our strategy forward? And then the really curious question I usually like to ask, because it is around, if we do know those trends and we don't ask on them, what threats is that going to cause for us? And that can be for organizations we work for, boards we serve on, our own families, even, as we look to just be more curious as people. And all of that's kind of focused on, that big one that we think about a lot is start with why. Yeah. And a lot of times when you start with why, the curiosity just kind of naturally evolves.
That's amazing. I have thoughts on that, but I'm just going to end it there because that summed it all up so nicely. Pam, I can't thank you enough. for making this work and being on the show today. It's been amazing conversation, as we always have. And I have a feeling we'll have to have a part 2 or 3 or 4 down the road, not only on curiosity, but I think we're curious in a bunch of topics that we can bring to the community. And I think that's the other very important thing, is be involved. Be involved in the community, be curious, find out information from your community, the things you're interested. There is a community there for you. Like, you've gotten involved with the World Employment Federation on a global scale, and it's incredible, and so many other things. But the community aspect of sharing information is there, and hopefully we've shared some fun stuff today.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I'm the one who feel really grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation with you as we look at it. And you're one of the most curious people I know, just so you know. And even starting this format for doing this, it's so different than most. And what I would just like to say is, it's great that it's kind of great and a little scary that we brought people into our conversations. Hopefully people will like that. But I think what's even better is this is going to go out on social channels. Anybody listening to this, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Engage with us. Let's get in the conversation together because we have a lot to learn from each other. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Jeff.
Awesome. Thank you.